Was he crazy? Was he touched by the divine? Was he an opportunist, a cult leader? No matter which, she became the closest advisor to the Tsarina of Russia. Members of the royal family felt they had to get rid of the monk. But why would members of the royal family feel the need to kill Grigori Rasputin? Why did the mad monk have to die? Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick. This week, Kim and I jump back to the pre-Bolshevik Revolution Russia to examine the very dirty deeds of Grigori Rasputin. With me, as always, is my wonderful wife, the unapologetic, unqualified Kimberly. Are you ready to travel back to 1916 Russia and learn about one crazy SOB who helped cause the collapse of a dynasty that ruled for 304 years?
Let's go, Mick. I packed my sarcasm, bottle of hand sanitizer for the trip. Let's dig into this dirty past again.
And 1916 Russia, you might need that hand sanitizer. The Romanovs ruled Russia beginning in 1613 in an odd way for an autocratic dynasty to begin. Mikhail Romanov was elected Tsar on the 21st of February, 1613, by a Simsky Sorba, or National Assembly, that was called together to elect a new ruler after Fedor I died without a legitimate heir. Again, showing once more the major issue with hereditary rule. Fodor's death ushered in a period known as the Time of Trouble. A power vacuum and numerous pretenders to the throne caused the nobles and clergy to seek a new czar to bring stability to Russia. Mikhail quickly moved to end the ongoing war with Poland and solidify power in the monarchy. What started with a democratic-ish move to elect a new leader led to an autocratic dynasty that would stabilize and expand Russia. Mikhail's descendant, Peter the Great, would turn Russia into a major European power, and Catherine the Great, Romanov by marriage, would begin to bring more expansion and the Enlightenment thinking to Russia. This is not to say that the Romanovs didn't have their issues. Catherine actually came to power by overthrowing her own husband. And you thought your Thanksgiving dinners were awkward. Peter III wasn't the only czar to have his life cut short before the end of the dynasty. The mid-1700s was the age of palace coups, as different aristocrats supported different royals in a bid to be the power behind the throne. And in 1764, it led to the assassination of Ivan VI. Now, poor Ivan, he became czar at the ripe old age of 2 months. Now, obviously, his mother ruled as a proxy during this time. Then, in 1 year, he was deposed and jailed, spending most of his childhood in prison. So understand, that means at 14 months old, he was thrown in prison. While first he was kept with his family, later he was moved to isolation while still a child.
The terrible twos.
Ivan was not allowed to learn to read or write or even know who he really was. It is unlikely he had any idea that he was once czar, nor did he have any understanding of his potential importance. During the reign of Catherine the Great, a nobleman attempted to break Ivan out of prison in 1764 as part of yet another coup attempt. The jailbreak failed. Guards had standing orders to kill Ivan if there ever were an attempted jailbreak. They did as ordered, stabbing the 23-year-old former child emperor to death.
So, Russia's version of royal daycare was solitary confinement with a side of stabbing. Cute.
Russians have never been accused of being soft. Of course, Catherine the Great most likely had her husband killed after she removed him from power, but it was her son Paul I who would meet with a more public and unquestionable demise. It seems that Paul really didn't like his mother and greatly favored his father. So when Catherine died, Paul came to the throne and he rolled back many of the reforms of Catherine the Great. This didn't win the paranoid tyrant many friends. Fearing his growing list of enemies, he basically locked himself away in his castle, St. Michael's, in the middle of St. Petersburg. But that did him little good, as noble officers in his palace guard broke into his room on the 12th of March, 1801, and beat the Tsar before choking him to death with his own scarf. The next morning, his son, Alexander I, was crowned Tsar. This, however, did little to calm the political bloodlust, and that was all around the Romanovs. An interesting side note, no other Tsar ever lived in St. Michael's again after that, and reportedly, Paul's ghost still hangs out in the castle. Starting in 1861, Alexander II started bold reforms in Russia. He freed the serfs, an act that in theory gave freedom to millions of peasants. One little problem: without money or land, the peasants had no choice but to return to work for the very lords they had been freed from. It would require decades of basically free labor on their part before they could claim ownership of any land. Before long, people longing for true reform saw Alexander's weak attempt to better their lives of the serfs. Then it seemed more like an evil act of treachery. The assassination attempts started to pile up. They blew up a room in the Winter Palace, only to find out that the Tsar wasn't there at the time. Next, shots were fired at him. For a while, it looked as if he was untouchable. On March 1st, 1861, revolutionaries threw a bomb at his royal carriage. The explosion injured many of his guards. Alexander II, maybe believing he was indestructible, got out of the carriage to inspect the damage. At that point, a Polish revolutionary suicide bomber tossed a second bomb, killing the Tsar and himself. Alexander II's son and heir, Alexander III, had the Church of the Savior of Spilled Blood built on the site of the assassination. You can still see it today.
Yes, he learned the hard way that indestructible in life is about as real as it is on a dog toy, non existent.
The 1800s were a rough time in Russia. Pogroms, which are state sponsored ethnic murders, ill advised wars, attempted revolutions had all left the Romanovs' governing empire in crisis. And in 1894, Alexander III died at just 49 years old, and power passed to his 26-year-old son, Nicholas II. Less than a month later, Nicholas married Princess Alexandria of Hesse, a German state. At first, the handsome young couple marked hope for reform and stability, but it might have been Nicholas's own words that foretold the future of the monarchy. He said, quote, "I am not prepared to be czar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." Now, while some might think this was some show of humbleness on his part, he would do everything he could to prove the fact that he was, in fact, had no idea to govern. His official rule started off about as bad as possible. His coronation would take place in 1895 at a crowded celebration as bread was being passed out to the peasants as a show of the love of their new czar. Thousands were trampled to death. The royal couple, unaware of the tragic events, made a public show of all smiles at the coronation ball later that same day. So all these people trampled, they're out partying, having a great time. Understandably, this did not give a very good first impression of the new czar. If that were the only issue, then Nicholas might have been able to bounce back. Unfortunately for both the Romanovs and Russia, it seemed good old Nick had some other major character issues. Most pressing was that it seemed that he really had no idea what he was doing. It was not uncommon for him to change his mind often based solely on whatever idea was presented to him last. It was said that he was out of his elements, that he really just longed for a life as a country landowner. Maybe it was because his father died young at 49 that Nicholas seemed to lack both the will and even the training to govern.
So the empire's fate rested with a man whose decision making process was basically last one to speak to me wins. Winging it isn't the best strategy for managing 125 million people.
If he had one positive trait, it was his deep loyalty and love for his Tsarina, Alexandria. She would be his closest advisor, and unlike her husband, she seemed to be able to actually take and hold a position. The only problem was that those positions, which often then became the position of Nicholas, were not always the best. After all, the Tsarina had her advisors as well, and the most influential of those was Grigori Rasputin. Rasputin was born to a peasant family in Siberian village of Pokrovsky. My Russian is almost as bad as my Japanese. On the 21st of January in 1869, his father was a peasant farmer and church elder who also worked for a time as a government courier, which basically meant just transporting packages and goods around this little corner of Siberia. The records conflict, stating that he was either one of 8 or 9 children, but it would seem only Rasputin and one sister lived beyond early childhood. Like most peasants living in rural Siberia in the late 1800s, Rasputin would have had little to no formal education and was likely illiterate until his early adulthood. Also, few records exist of his early life. Not surprising. It's not like people were running around Siberia in the 1780s and 1770s taking notes of what peasant boys were getting into. While later stories would claim that Rasputin was involved in numerous serious crimes as a young man, most of those stories actually lack any real evidence and seem to be created by his many political enemies. What records do show is that he was in trouble, often linked to heavy drinking and some petty theft. Traveling in 1886, he met a young woman named Praskovia, and after courting for several months, they married in February of 1887. They would have 7 children together, but only 3 would survive to adulthood. Praskovia would remain loyal and devoted to Rasputin until his death, despite the fact that he would leave her and the children for long stretches and reportedly had numerous lovers.
Let me get this straight. He can't read, steals stuff, drinks too much, cheats on his wife, and still people thought, yep, this is the guy for the royal family. And I love how the historians debate whether he had 8 siblings or 9, but they can't agree on how many crimes he committed.
Well,
Priorities.
maybe in rural Russia at the time it was a lot easier to count kids, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you know, as opposed to counting crimes. I don't know.
True.
After 10 years of marriage at age 28, Rasputin rediscovered religion in 1897. He would leave the village on a pilgrimage. Again, sources conflict on why the sudden need to leave his family, including an infant son and pregnant wife. Some claim that he had a vision of the Virgin Mary came to him. Others said he was inspired by a young theologian. Still others said he was escaping charges for stealing a horse. So either oh, religious, conversion, or I better get out of here before they hang me as a horse thief. Whatever caused him to leave the village, he found his way to St. Nicholas Monastery. Here, he started his religious education, and it was most likely also where he learned to read and write. After several months, he left the monastery. He later claimed that some of the monks were practicing homosexuality and that the monastery was too sinful. Returning to his village, he seemed like a changed man. He gave up drinking, at least for the time, became a vegetarian, and threw himself into prayer and religious worship. Soon, he became a strannik, or religious wanderer. For the next few years, he would leave the village and his family and wander Siberia, visiting holy sites and preaching to anyone who would listen. often gone for months or even over a year. He was developing a small but loyal following. In his village, he built a makeshift chapel in his father's root cellar. There, he and his followers held services that seemed somewhat secretive in nature. Rumors spread that Rasputin had female worshippers bathe him and that orgies occurred as part of his preaching. While some of this might have been from the village elders and other religious leaders who wanted to discredit him and were becoming jealous of his growing popularity, similar accusations would follow him for the rest of his life.
Becomes a religious traveler and somehow manages to make scandal a full-time ministry. Extracurricular baptisms, anyone? Totally wholesome, of course.
Totally wholesome. By the early 1900s, Rasputin was starting to become well known across his region. His charisma, his hypnotic like stare, were earning him more and more followers. Around 1905, he arrived in the city of Kazan, where he gained a reputation as a great scaret or elder who could ease people's religious crisis. As these stories spread, local religious leaders took an interest in the now 35-year-old monk. They wrote him letters of introduction and arranged for him to travel to St. Petersburg. When Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg, the city's elite were, like much of European and American aristocracy, caught up in the craze of spiritualism and occultism. It was the perfect time for someone like Rasputin with his unorthodox ideas. It was his connection to the Kylist movement that gave rise to many of the stories about his wild and ravenous sexual appetite. Kylists believed that sin could be used to get you closer to God. They would self flagellate, whip themselves, drink heavy, and take part in orgies, all with the idea that this would somehow bring them religious clarity and a better understanding of God. And while historians disagree as to whether or not he was actually a practicing Kylist, he was at least influenced by some of their practices. He would often hold religious meetings in saloons and was commonly seen in the company of what could be called unsavory characters. But it was a run in with the Black Princesses, Melista and Anastasia of Montenegro, that would put him on the path to become an advisor to the Tsarina. The Black Princesses were both married to cousins of Tsar Nicholas. They were also well-known party girls and occultists. Shortly after his arrival in St. Petersburg, Rasputin had become closely tied to the princesses. The two were taken with Rasputin, the charismatic holy man from the far reaches of the empire, so much so that they introduced him to the royal family.
And just like that, a party-loving holy man walks into the palace, and boom, the royal family's slow-motion train wreck begins.
Rasputin would be an odd figure among the royal court in St. Petersburg. He was not a big follower of personal hygiene. His hair often looked unwashed and unkept. His monk robes were dirty. People claimed that he had a hypnotic personality, with some saying that especially women found themselves drawn to the charismatic Siberian. And it might have been that led to rumors that he had enchanted his followers, as many said, with dark magic that gave him the power over others. The Tsar and Tsarina were intrigued when they first met Rasputin, but far from overwhelmed, Nicholas simply wrote in his diary, quote, "Today we met a man of God, Grigori from the Treblinski province." The royal couple, this wandering monk from the wilds of Siberia with his reputation as a healer of both physical and spiritual needs, would have been fascinating, but not as of yet in a position to hold much influence.
The royal couple meets a wandering monk. Fascinating, they said. What could possibly go wrong?
It almost sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. A wandering monk steps into the palace. Rasputin left the capital and returned to his village for a short time. Then, in October 1906, he returned to St. Petersburg and was granted an audience with the Tsar and Tsarina. On this trip, he brought a gift, an icon of Saint Simon of Versk hot Tura. Nicholas wrote to one of his ministers of court, "He made a remarkably strong impression on both Her Majesty and myself, so that instead of 5 minutes, our conversation went on for more than an hour." With his foot in the door, Rasputin began to make himself more and more indispensable to the royal couple. But it would be Rasputin's interactions with the young Prince Alexei that would cement his position as the most trusted advisor to the Tsarina. Alexei had been born on the 12th of August, 1904. It had been discovered early on that the boy suffered from hemophilia, an inability for the blood to clot. In 1904, there was no treatment for the disorder, and any slight cut or even a bruise could prove fatal. This was a double tragedy for the family. First, there was the constant fear that the young boy could die from even the slightest injury. Second, as the only son among 5 children, he was the hope to continue the Romanov dynasty. When news spread of Alexei's condition, the people blamed Tsarina Alexandria. The German born queen had never been popular with the common people, and now it seemed she was tainting the royal bloodline. As any desperate mother would, she looked for help anywhere she could find it, including turning to faith healers and occultists.
The heir could bleed to death from a scratch, and the royal household was in full on panic mode.
In 1907, Alexei was in the middle of a particularly bad episode. Doctors could do nothing to stop the bleeding. Alexandria called for Rasputin, whom she had come to see as a powerful holy man. The monk was able to calm the panicked mother and reassure her that the boy would be okay. Then he started to pray over the child. Shortly after, the bleeding stopped. This was all the proof the royal couple needed. Rasputin had been sent from God to save their son. While it is unclear just what Rasputin did to help the boy, whether it was simply calming the mother, which in turn calmed the 3-year-old prince, or did he administer some type of folk healing he learned as a boy in Siberia? Was it an actual miracle performed at the hands of a holy man? Or might it simply have been that Rasputin stopped Alexei's doctors from giving him aspirin, which today we know to be a blood thinner? So if you're a hemophiliac, aspirin is a big no-no. Alexei was not cured, but when under Rasputin's care, his bleeding was far less severe. He was now a major part of the Romanov inner circle, and his advice went far beyond the health of the prince.
Totally unqualified, winging it every step of the way, and somehow calling all the shots for the entire empire. Honestly, I can totally relate to that, except I have a little less power, but I'm probably slightly better looking.
Well, yeah, I've seen the pictures of Rasputin. Trust me, you are much better looking than Grigori Rasputin. While Rasputin held no official position within the government, he had the ear of the Tsarina. While Nicholas was never as devoted to Rasputin and might have even questioned him at times, he was heavily influenced by Alexandria, so it was that Rasputin had an indirect but powerful connection to the Tsar. As Rasputin's influence grew, so did the list of those people who felt he was a corrupting force on the royal family. A radical priest named Ildor, who had once been a follower of Rasputin, started to preach that Rasputin had become an evil force sent to destroy the Romanovs. Rumors even started to circulate that Rasputin and the Tsarina were lovers. While no evidence supports this claim, many of the common people believed it. Of course, they already hated the Tsarina. During the same time period, Europe was inching towards a major catastrophe. It was not a good time to be the Tsar. A bloody attempted revolution, a brutal crackdown, a war in the Balkans all had the culminating effect of pushing the Tsar's popularity to subterranean levels. Then in 1914, world-altering events would occur.
Honestly, being the czar at this point sounds like the worst job listing ever. Wanted, one monarch, must enjoy constant political chaos, endless wars, and having the entire country hate you. Perks? None.
It's almost like being Tsar is the equivalent of the 7th grade PE teacher of monarchs. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand started the cogs turning, causing the First World War. Nicholas might have seen the war as a way to improve his popularity after the war. After all, war brings out patriotism in people, flags fly, and common folks rally around their government. After all, it has been said, war is the health of the state. At the same time, Rasputin was almost killed by an alleged prostitute. On the 29th of June, 1914, Gazyana Gustava stabbed Rasputin in the gut so badly that reportedly his entrails spilled out. A follower of Illidor, she screamed, "I have killed the Antichrist," after stabbing him. Despite massive blood loss, Rasputin survived after undergoing emergency surgery. The attack strengthened his reputation as a man protected by God. To the Tsarina, it was further proof that Rasputin was meant to be the savior of the Romanov dynasty.
Massive blood loss, intestines on the floor, and Rasputin still pulled through. Honestly, at this point, he was less holy man and more horror movie villain. You kill him in Act 1, and by Act 3, he's knocking on your door like, "Here's Rasputin."
When the war started to go bad for Russia, the Tsar made the decision to head to the front line and lead the troops himself. It doesn't take a genius to see that this was not the best idea. A commander unable to make decisions who just follows the last piece of advice given might not be the best person to lead your troops in the bloodiest conflict known to man. It also means that he left Alexandria in charge back in St. Petersburg. On the home front, the economy tanked. Food and fuel shortages left people cold and hungry. Massive protests broke out across St. Petersburg and in Moscow. Some started to believe that it was Rasputin who was actually running the government in St. Petersburg. Calls came to remove Rasputin from the royal orbit, while others inside the royal circle thought that if Rasputin was no longer in the picture, the dynasty could be saved from potential revolution. Nothing
Screamed competent administration, like pinning the empire's collapse on one sketchy monk instead of, you know, decades of royal incompetence.
Well, you might not want to tell the czar that he is like totally worthless and blame it on the scary looking guy with the crazy eyes from Siberia. A group of nobles chose to act, led by Prince Felix Yusupov and the Grand Duke Dmitry Kalovich. On the night of the 29th and 30th of December, they summoned Rasputin to Yusupov's castle. The following is based on the accounts given by Yusupov. Once at the castle, they prepared wine and cakes laced with cyanide. Rasputin at first refused the cakes and wine, but after a while, he indulged, a little royal peer pressure. It seemed that the cyanide had no effect on the monk. The poison not working, Yusupov decided that force would be needed, so he took a revolver and shot Rasputin in the chest. When the monk collapsed to the ground, they were sure the deed was done. But according to Yusupov's account, after a short while, Rasputin suddenly revived and attacked him. The wounded monk then crawled from the room out into the courtyard. The conspirators followed Rasputin into the courtyard, firing several more rounds into the monk until he finally stopped moving. The body was then wrapped in a rug, tied with heavy chains, and thrown from a bridge into the frozen Malya Nevika River. Later stories expanded on the tale, claiming that Rasputin was still alive and was able to get free from his bonds, but drowned before making it ashore. Yusupov wrote in his account, including the idea that he had to convince passing police officers that the shots were simple horseplay. The overly dramatic story by Yusupov was likely heavily embellished. The official autopsy reports listed the cause of death as gunshot wounds, pointing especially to one delivered at close range to the head.
The autopsy, of course, ruined the theatrics by pointing out the obvious. He died because someone shot him in the head. Duh, mystery solved.
The conspirators went into a brief hiding, but they weren't executed or even harshly punished for that matter. Just a quiet exile from St. Petersburg, likely because Rasputin's assassination was very popular among the common people, and the Romanovs needed any good press they could get. The murder did nothing to quell the growing hatred of the monarchy. The fact was, without Rasputin, Alexandria lost all confidence. And with that, Nicholas lost his most trusted advisor. Reality is, dead or alive, Rasputin was not going to save the dynasty. Just 2 months after his death, the revolution forced the Tsar to abdicate. Then, little over a year later, on the 16th and 17th of July, 1918, the Tsar, Tsarina, and their 5 children were killed by Bolsheviks to ensure the end of the Romanov dynasty. Grigori Rasputin, the cleric from Siberia. Was he the mad monk? Was he a faithful advisor to the Tsar and Tsarina? Was he the reason for the downfall of the dynasty? Most likely not. The Romanov dynasty was well past its prime, and Nicholas was in no position to rule. But his death and his life left us with a story that still fascinates us over 100 years later. This has been History is Criminal. Join Kim and I next week as we take a look at the crimes, or maybe alleged crimes, of Ma Barker. Was she a criminal mastermind or just a mother with some unruly boys? And as usual, if you like what you heard, tell a friend, and if not, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.